Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris. Two names that stand at the very summit of martial arts history. Two men whose legacies have transcended generations, cultures, and even the line between reality and myth. Their famous on-screen battle in Way of the Dragon is often called the greatest martial arts fight ever filmed. It's been analyzed frame by frame, debated endlessly, and immortalized in pop culture. But there's one question that has never stopped haunting fans around the world. Strip away the cameras. Remove the choreography. Forget the scripts and the cinematic pauses. If Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris fought for real, who would actually win? Today, we're diving deep into the truth behind the legends. Not the movie version. Not the fan fantasies. But the real dynamics, the real skills, the real philosophies, and the real human limits that would decide a genuine fight between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris. This is not about hype. This is about reality. And the answer may not be what you expect. To understand this matchup, we need to go back to a time before either man became a global icon. Before fame. Before myth. Before the world started projecting larger-than-life narratives onto two very real martial artists who took their craft seriously enough to stake their entire lives on it. Bruce Lee's journey began in chaos and motion. Born in San Francisco but raised in Hong Kong, he grew up in an environment where fighting wasn't optional. Street gangs, school rivalries, and constant confrontations shaped him early. Martial arts were not a hobby for Bruce. They were survival. He trained Wing Chun under Ip Man, but even then, he was never satisfied with limits. From the beginning, Bruce questioned everything. Why this stance? Why that rule? Why this technique and not another? That restless mind became his greatest weapon. Chuck Norris came from a very different world. Raised in the United States, his early life lacked Bruce's constant exposure to street violence. Instead, Norris found structure, discipline, and identity through martial arts later in life while serving in the U.S. Air Force. Stationed in Korea, he trained in Tang Soo Do and quickly demonstrated an exceptional aptitude for combat sports. Unlike Bruce, Chuck thrived in rule-based competition. Tournaments. Points. Championships. Clear winners and losers. He didn't just compete, he dominated. By the late 1960s, Chuck Norris was the most feared karate competitor in America. He held multiple world titles and remained undefeated in professional competition for years. His reputation wasn't built on philosophy or flair. It was built on results. Brutal efficiency. Controlled aggression. Perfected fundamentals. Where Bruce Lee was questioning the system, Chuck Norris was conquering it. Their paths crossed not as rivals, but as colleagues and friends. Chuck Norris was already a respected martial artist when Bruce arrived in the United States and began teaching. In fact, Norris openly credited Bruce Lee with helping him break into Hollywood. There was mutual respect. Mutual admiration. No bad blood. Which makes the question even more fascinating. Because this isn't about ego or hatred. It's about capability. The famous fight scene in Way of the Dragon was designed to symbolize something deeper than two men trading blows. Bruce choreographed it as a clash of philosophies. The traditional martial artist versus the adaptive innovator. Structure versus freedom. Power versus precision. Every movement in that scene was intentional. Every exchange told a story. And by the end, Bruce's character prevails not because he's stronger, but because he evolves. But real fights don't follow symbolism. They follow physics, conditioning, psychology, and timing. And that's where things get complicated. Physically, Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris were not as far apart as many people assume. Bruce stood around 5 feet 8 inches and weighed approximately 140 to 145 pounds in peak condition. Chuck Norris was slightly taller and heavier, usually around 170 pounds during his competitive years. That difference matters. In real combat, weight is not just mass, it's inertia, resistance, and damage absorption. Bruce Lee's body was engineered for speed. His muscle density was extraordinary. His body fat was famously low. Every ounce of his physique was functional. Explosive. Reactive. Bruce could strike with shocking speed and retract just as fast. His famous one-inch punch wasn't a parlor trick. It was a demonstration of kinetic efficiency. Chuck Norris, by contrast, was built like a tank by martial arts standards. thick legs, dense core, powerful hips. His kicks were devastating, particularly his roundhouse, which later became his signature. Norris didn't rely on flurries. He relied on ending exchanges decisively. One clean kick. One solid punch. One opening exploited fully. Speed versus power is one of the oldest debates in combat. But the truth is, neither wins automatically. What matters is how each fighter imposes their preferred range. Bruce Lee excelled at broken rhythm. He didn't move in predictable patterns. He would feint, probe, retreat, then explode forward with lightning speed. His footwork allowed him to control distance better than almost anyone of his era. Against slower opponents, Bruce could dominate without taking damage. He could hit without being hit. Chuck Norris, however, was not slow. This is where many people misunderstand the matchup. Norris wasn't a lumbering heavyweight. He was a world-class athlete with exceptional timing. His reactions were honed in real competitive environments where mistakes cost points and titles. He knew how to read opponents, how to bait attacks, and how to counter with precision. In a real fight, the early moments would be critical. Bruce Lee would almost certainly test Chuck with fast jabs, low kicks, and sudden entries. He would look to disrupt Norris's base, force him to react, and prevent him from setting his feet. Bruce understood that power is most dangerous when planted. Chuck Norris, on the other hand, would aim to establish distance and rhythm. He would not chase Bruce. He would wait. Norris was famous for his patience in competition. He didn't need volume. He needed timing. One well-timed counter kick could change everything. Conditioning would play a major role. Bruce Lee trained obsessively for endurance. Road work, skipping rope, shadowboxing, strength circuits. His philosophy emphasized stamina because he believed real fights were unpredictable and could extend longer than expected. He wanted to be fresh when others faded. Chuck Norris also possessed elite conditioning, but his training emphasized explosive output. Tournament fighting is intense but intermittent. Bursts of action followed by resets. Over time, this difference matters. In a prolonged, continuous fight, Bruce's gas tank could become a decisive advantage. Then there's adaptability. This may be Bruce Lee's greatest edge. Bruce was not loyal to style. He was loyal to effectiveness. If something wasn't working, he discarded it instantly. He studied boxing footwork, fencing timing, wrestling principles, and Eastern martial arts simultaneously. Jeet Kune Do wasn't a style, it was a process. Chuck Norris was more traditional, but that doesn't mean rigid. He evolved over time, integrating different influences and later becoming an early advocate of cross-training. However, during the period most people imagine this fight taking place, late 1960s to early 1970s, Norris was still primarily a traditional striker. Mentality is another critical factor. Bruce Lee approached combat as expression. He believed fighting revealed truth. That mindset made him fearless, but it also meant he was willing to take risks. Chuck Norris approached combat as competition. He was disciplined, cautious, and calculated. He didn't gamble unless necessary. In a real fight, psychology often decides the outcome before technique does. Bruce's intensity could overwhelm opponents psychologically. His presence alone unsettled people. His speed made others hesitate. Chuck Norris, however, was no stranger to pressure. He thrived in high-stakes environments. He didn't panic. He didn't rush. If this fight took place in a confined space, Bruce's chances improve significantly. Close quarters favor speed, hand trapping, elbows, and disruption. Bruce specialized in that range. He could smother Norris's kicking game and force infighting. If the fight occurred in an open space with room to maneuver, Chuck Norris's odds increase. Distance allows kicks to shine. It allows timing and counters. It allows power to express itself fully. Another factor rarely discussed is damage tolerance. Chuck Norris was accustomed to contact. Tournament fighting involves impact, but also stress conditioning and repeated clashes. Bruce Lee trained realistically, but he also focused on avoiding damage entirely. In a real fight, the ability to absorb punishment can matter just as much as the ability to deliver it. There is no evidence that Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris ever fought seriously outside of training or film work. But there are accounts of intense sparring sessions, mutual testing, and deep respect. Chuck Norris himself consistently stated that Bruce Lee was faster than anyone he had ever seen. That statement alone carries weight. But speed does not guarantee victory. Timing beats speed. Power changes outcomes instantly. And endurance only matters if the fight lasts long enough. If Bruce Lee could maintain control of distance, frustrate Norris, and force a prolonged exchange, the fight would likely tilt in his favor over time. His precision, stamina, and adaptability would gradually break down Norris's offense. If Chuck Norris could land clean early, especially with a kick or heavy counter, the fight could end abruptly. Norris did not need many openings. He needed one. So who wins? The most honest answer is this: there is no guaranteed winner. This fight exists in a razor-thin margin where environment, timing, and a single mistake could decide everything. Bruce Lee represents evolution, speed, and fluid intelligence. Chuck Norris represents discipline, power, and battle-tested execution. What makes this matchup eternal is not certainty, but balance. Two masters, two paths, two truths about combat colliding. And perhaps that's why this question still matters. Not because we need a winner, but because in exploring it, we learn something deeper about fighting, philosophy, and ourselves. So now the question turns to you. In a real fight, do you believe speed and adaptability would overcome power and precision? Or does controlled aggression and timing always find a way? Let us know what you think. Because when people argue about Bruce Lee versus Chuck Norris, they're not really arguing about two men. They're arguing about two worldviews. Two ways of approaching conflict. Two answers to the same ancient question: what actually works when everything is stripped away? To go even deeper, we have to look at something most fans ignore completely: the rules. Or more specifically, the absence of them. Chuck Norris came up in an environment where rules shaped behavior. Even at the highest level of karate competition, there were boundaries. Illegal strikes. Point stoppages. Referees. Structure. This doesn't diminish Norris's ability in any way, but it does shape instincts. Competitive fighters are trained to exploit rules as much as techniques. They learn what's allowed, what's rewarded, and what's penalized. Over time, those instincts become automatic. Bruce Lee, on the other hand, actively rejected rules. Not out of rebellion, but out of practicality. He believed rules created habits that could become liabilities in real combat. That belief is what drove him to dismantle traditional forms and rebuild them into something fluid. He trained for chaos, for unpredictability, for moments when nothing goes as planned. In a real fight with no referee, no rounds, and no time limits, those differences matter. Bruce Lee would not wait for a reset. He would not disengage out of courtesy. He would press advantages relentlessly. Eye-line disruption, off-balancing, continuous pressure. These were all part of his thinking, even if he rarely spoke about them publicly. Chuck Norris, however, was not naive to real violence. His military background exposed him to discipline under stress. He understood consequences. He understood control. And control is not weakness, it's restraint. In a real fight, restraint can become precision. One overlooked factor is mindset under uncertainty. Bruce Lee thrived in uncertainty. He embraced it. His philosophy of being like water was not poetic fluff, it was a mental framework for adaptability. Water doesn't resist force. It redirects it. It fills gaps. It waits and then overwhelms. Chuck Norris thrived in clarity. Clear objectives. Clear execution. Clear dominance. When the path was defined, he was nearly unstoppable. But chaos introduces variables. Variables favor improvisation. Then there's the issue of reach and kicking dynamics. Chuck Norris's kicks were not just powerful, they were technically elite. His roundhouse could land from distances most fighters felt safe. His hip rotation generated torque that transferred cleanly into impact. Against average opponents, that alone ended fights. Bruce Lee countered kicks differently than most. Instead of blocking hard, he intercepted. Low-line kicks. Shin and knee attacks. Oblique stomps designed not to score points, but to damage structure. Bruce didn't aim to hurt immediately, He aimed to disable over time. This difference highlights a brutal truth. Bruce Lee fought for consequences. Chuck Norris fought for results. If the fight escalated to grappling, the equation shifts again. Neither man was a dedicated grappler in the modern sense. No Brazilian jiu-jitsu. No wrestling heavy base. But Bruce Lee actively studied grappling concepts, particularly balance, leverage, and positional dominance. He trained takedown defense and understood clinch control. Chuck Norris, heavier and stronger, would have an advantage in raw strength in close contact. If he managed to secure a dominant hold early, that weight difference could become dangerous for Bruce. But securing that hold against Bruce's speed would be the challenge. Pain tolerance is another layer. Bruce Lee conditioned his body intensely. Forearm smashing, shin conditioning, grip strength, and nerve desensitization were all part of his regimen. He wasn't fragile. He was hardened. But Chuck Norris had years of full-contact competition experience. He knew what it felt like to be hit hard and keep going. This brings us to a critical and uncomfortable point. No fight between two elite martial artists is clean. Someone gets hurt. Something goes wrong. And often, the winner is the one who can still function when things stop being ideal. Bruce Lee's greatest strength, speed, requires space, timing, and rhythm. Chuck Norris's greatest strength, power, requires commitment. If Norris committed and missed, Bruce could punish him severely. If Norris committed and landed, Bruce could be in serious trouble. Another aspect rarely mentioned is emotional control. Bruce Lee was intense. Deeply intense. His focus bordered on obsession. That intensity fueled brilliance, but it also meant he burned hot. Chuck Norris was calmer, more reserved, more methodical. In prolonged high-stress situations, emotional regulation matters. Yet Bruce's intensity also meant ferocity. He didn't fight halfway. He didn't test casually when stakes were real. That kind of commitment can overwhelm opponents who hesitate. There's also the myth versus man problem. By the early 1970s, Bruce Lee had become larger than life. People projected supernatural abilities onto him. Chuck Norris, despite his accolades, was still seen as human. That perception affects how people talk about this fight, but it doesn't affect physics. The reality is this: Bruce Lee was not invincible. Chuck Norris was not unbeatable. Both were exceptional because they understood their strengths and worked relentlessly to sharpen them. If this fight happened 10 times, the outcomes would vary. Some scenarios favor Bruce. Some favor Chuck. That's the honest truth. In a fast, chaotic encounter where Bruce dictates tempo and distance, his chances skyrocket. He overwhelms, disrupts, and exhausts. In a slower, more measured exchange where Norris maintains range and waits for his moment, one clean strike could change everything. This is why the debate never ends. Because both answers are defensible. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: both men would likely tell you the fight itself isn't the point. Bruce Lee believed martial arts were about self-discovery. Chuck Norris believed they were about discipline and respect. Neither philosophy requires domination to be valid. But fans will always ask, who wins? Because the question is timeless. Because it mirrors our own struggles. Speed versus strength. Adaptation versus tradition. Freedom versus structure. So when you choose a side, you're not just choosing a fighter. You're choosing a way of thinking. And that's why this matchup will never die. And even after everything is weighed, measured, and analyzed, there's still one final layer that refuses to disappear: the human factor. Because no matter how legendary the names become, no matter how many philosophies we compare, at the end of the day, a real fight is not decided on paper. It's decided in moments. Fractions of seconds. Decisions made under pressure that no training fully replicates. Bruce Lee understood this deeply. He often spoke about the danger of becoming too attached to any single method. He warned that styles could become prisons. That habits could blind you at the exact moment you needed clarity most. His constant evolution wasn't just about technique, it was about staying mentally free. In a real fight, that freedom could mean the difference between adapting instantly or freezing for just a split second too long. Chuck Norris understood something just as important, but from the opposite direction. He believed discipline creates freedom. That repetition builds instinct. That when chaos erupts, the body should move without hesitation because it has already been there thousands of times before. His tournament experience ingrained this. Under bright lights, crowds watching, titles on the line, he learned how to execute without emotion clouding judgment. So whose mental framework holds up better when things go wrong? If Bruce Lee is clipped early, can he recover and adjust fast enough? If Chuck Norris is pressured non-stop, can he remain patient long enough to find his opening? These are questions no highlight reel can answer. There's also the issue of escalation. Real fights don't stay static. They escalate. Strikes get harder. Risks increase. Fatigue sets in. Pain accumulates. The fighter who adapts to that escalation faster often gains the upper hand. Bruce Lee trained with escalation in mind. His conditioning emphasized recovery under stress. His philosophy accepted that chaos grows, and the fighter must grow with it. Chuck Norris trained to end fights before escalation became a factor. His goal was always clean dominance, not prolonged exchanges. That contrast alone makes this matchup endlessly fascinating. And then there's legacy bias. Bruce Lee's life was cut tragically short, freezing him in time at his peak. Chuck Norris lived long enough for the world to see him age, evolve, and eventually transition into acting roles that shifted public perception. That imbalance shapes how people subconsciously judge this fight. But when you strip away myth, nostalgia, and internet exaggeration, what remains is respect. Real respect. The kind that only exists between warriors who recognize excellence in one another. Chuck Norris has never spoken dismissively of Bruce Lee. Quite the opposite. He has consistently acknowledged Bruce's speed, intelligence, and revolutionary impact. Bruce Lee, in turn, valued Norris as a legitimate martial artist, not just a performer. That mutual respect tells us something important. Neither man believed the outcome was obvious. That alone should humble any argument. So if the fight happened in a real environment, with no cameras, no choreography, no audience, what happens? The most realistic outcome isn't a dramatic knockout. It's a battle of adjustments. Probing. Testing. A chess match played at full speed. Mistakes punished immediately. Opportunities seized without hesitation. Bruce Lee would push the pace, looking to break rhythm and force reactions. Chuck Norris would look for stillness, for the moment when movement becomes predictable. One thrives in motion, the other in timing. Eventually, something gives. It always does. Maybe Bruce's relentless pressure causes Norris to slow just enough. Maybe Norris's patience draws Bruce into one committed attack too many. Either way, the margin is razor thin. And that's the truth most people don't want to hear. There is no definitive winner. Only probabilities. Only scenarios. Which is exactly why this debate survives decades later. Because certainty is boring. Complexity is compelling. Bruce Lee versus Chuck Norris isn't about who would win every time. It's about why either could win at all. It's about what combat really is when stripped of fantasy, an expression of preparation meeting unpredictability. And perhaps the real answer lies somewhere deeper. Bruce Lee showed the world that martial arts could evolve, that limitations were self-imposed, that speed, intelligence, and adaptability could redefine combat. Chuck Norris showed the world that discipline, consistency, and mastery of fundamentals could produce undeniable results. Both were right. Both proved their truths in different ways. So when you ask who wins in a real fight, you're really asking something else entirely. Do you believe freedom beats structure? Or does structure eventually overcome freedom? That question has no final answer. Only choices. And that's why this fight, real or imagined, will never stop being discussed. Because long after the techniques are compared and the scenarios replayed, what lingers is the legacy of impact, how each man changed the very definition of martial arts for everyone who came after. Bruce Lee didn't just fight opponents. He fought stagnation. He fought the idea that tradition alone was enough. His influence reshaped how the world trained, how fighters cross-trained, and how combat was understood. Modern mixed martial arts, though born years later, carries Bruce Lee's fingerprints everywhere. Adaptability. Efficiency. Function over form. He planted seeds that others would harvest decades later. Chuck Norris, in contrast, embodied mastery within structure. He proved that traditional systems, when trained at the highest level, could dominate real competition. He legitimized martial arts in America through results, not philosophy. His success in tournaments gave credibility to disciplines that many once dismissed as impractical. He showed that discipline could be just as revolutionary as innovation. That difference matters because when people imagine this fight, they're also imagining two futures colliding. One path leads toward evolution and experimentation. The other toward refinement and mastery. And neither path is wrong. It's also worth considering something rarely acknowledged. Both men avoided unnecessary conflict in real life. Despite their reputations, neither sought street fights for ego. Bruce Lee believed fighting should be purposeful. Chuck Norris believed it should be controlled. That restraint is often misunderstood as weakness, but it's actually the mark of true martial artists. So in a real fight, both would enter with seriousness, not recklessness. There would be no wild brawling. No sloppy exchanges. This wouldn't look like a movie fight. It would look calculated, tense, and dangerous in its subtlety. Every movement would matter. Every breath would matter. And every mistake would carry consequences. Bruce Lee would likely probe constantly, refusing to let Norris settle. Chuck Norris would likely stay composed, conserving energy and waiting for commitment. Each would be testing not just the body, but the mind. Who blinks first? That question is impossible to answer definitively, and that's exactly why the debate survives. Because deep down, people don't actually want closure. They want the tension. They want the possibility. They want to imagine what happens when two peaks collide. Bruce Lee versus Chuck Norris endures because it's not a mismatch. It's not a fantasy. It's plausible, balanced, real. And in that balance lies its power. So maybe the real winner isn't Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris. Maybe the real winner is martial arts itself. Because through this question, generations continue to think critically about training, philosophy, and what truly matters in combat. Speed, power, endurance, discipline, adaptability, mindset. All of it matters. And all of it lives on because two men, walking different paths, reached the same summit. That is why this question will never disappear. And that is why, no matter which side you choose, you're still honoring both legends. And in the end, maybe that's the only conclusion that truly fits this matchup. Bruce Lee versus Chuck Norris was never meant to have a clean answer. Not because the question is flawed, but because the fighters themselves represent truths that can't cancel each other out. One does not invalidate the other. One does not erase the other. They coexist. Bruce Lee showed what happens when a mind refuses to accept limits. When curiosity becomes discipline. When speed, timing, and adaptability are sharpened into weapons. He proved that evolution is not betrayal, it is survival. His legacy lives in every fighter who refuses to be boxed into a single system, every athlete who asks, why, instead of blindly following, how. Chuck Norris showed what happens when discipline is taken to its absolute peak. When fundamentals are mastered so completely they become instinct. When power is controlled, timing is refined, and patience becomes lethal. His legacy lives in every fighter who believes repetition builds greatness, every competitor who trusts preparation over improvisation. So if they fought, truly fought, there would be no easy ending. No guaranteed outcome. Only moments. Decisions. Adjustments. One mistake. One opening. One breath taken too late or too early. And that's the truth most people avoid. Because real combat doesn't crown myths. It exposes humanity. Bruce Lee was human. Chuck Norris was human. Both were extraordinary because they embraced that fact and trained relentlessly to overcome it. So when you ask who would win in a real fight, understand what you're really asking. Are you drawn to freedom or structure? Adaptation or mastery? Flow or foundation? There is no wrong answer. Because both paths lead to greatness. And that's why this debate will never die.